Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back into the candlelit gloom of early modern Europe, where royal families were, let's say it, a little too committed to keeping the family tree shaped like a stick. So, settle in, dim the lights, wrap yourself in whatever blanket hasn't mysteriously disappeared into the laundry void, and let your breathing slow, just a little, as we wander into the quietly tragic, softly absurd life of a king whose entire existence was essentially a medical mystery wrapped in a velvet robe. Let's begin, very gently, with Charles II of Spain. Yes, that Charles, the one historians politely call the Bewitched, which honestly feels like a generous way of saying we have no idea what was going on. But something definitely was. A soft glide into the Habsburg swamp. Charles II was born in 1661, emerging into the world after generations of Habsburgs had married so closely that the family reunion and the wedding guest list were basically identical. You know it's bad when the official royal genealogists had to pause sometimes and say things like, wait, is this his cousin or his aunt, or both? Charles arrived as the final product of a dynasty that treated genetics like a suggestion. And of course, everyone acted surprised when things went poorly. But before we drift into the catalogue of his problems, let's imagine the atmosphere of his childhood palace. Quiet corridors, thick carpets, echoing halls that smelled faintly of incense and unwashed nobility. Outside, Spain's empire was creaking under its own weight, slowly collapsing like a very tired souffle. Inside, little Charles was swaddled in layers of silk and unrealistic expectations. He was the long-awaited heir. He was also, unfortunately, the long-expected genetic disaster, introducing Charles very gently from the moment he opened his eyes. It was clear Charles was struggling with, well, everything. Breathing, eating, standing, existing, you name it. He had difficulty with it. His famous Habsburg jaw, the family's signature architectural feature, had reached its final form in him. It jutted so dramatically that he couldn't chew properly. Imagine being royalty and still needing your food mashed like overcooked lentils. But his caretakers insisted he was perfectly fine, because of course they did. Admitting anything was wrong might imply that centuries of marrying cousins wasn't a brilliant strategy. So they pretended. Doctors insisted he'd grow out of it. Priests insisted he'd been cursed, and his tutors insisted he'd eventually learn to speak. He did slowly and painfully, although the words tended to slide out in ways that made chroniclers politely avoid quoting him directly. A childhood of cushions and concerned whispering, Charles spent most of his childhood indoors, surrounded by attendants whose job descriptions were basically prevent anything from happening to him. He didn't learn to walk until he was around 4 years old. Even then, it was less walking and more wobbling theatrically down the hall, like a decorative candle that had been left near a fireplace. He struggled with illness after illness, fevers, infections, episodes that sound suspiciously like seizures. And of course, the Spanish court reacted with its usual level of calm, dignified professionalism. They blamed witches, they blamed demons, they blamed France, because blaming France was a timeless tradition. Anything except the family tree looking like one long vertical line. Let's drift over, slowly, to the political situation, because nothing lulls the mind like 17th century Spanish bureaucracy. Spain, a powerhouse, but mostly out of habit. By the time Charles was born, Spain was no longer the fire-breathing empire it had been a century earlier. It was still technically huge, stretching across Europe, the Americas, and the Philippines, but the actual administrative energy keeping it afloat was roughly the same as a phone at 3% battery. The treasury was empty, the army was tired, the nobles were bickering, and Charles's father, Philip IV, was aging rapidly after a life spent producing portraits and heirs with varying degrees of success. So when little Charles arrived sickly, fragile, struggling, the entire kingdom tried to convince itself that he was a symbol of hope rather than what he was, a harbinger of dynastic collapse. People whispered that he was too weak, too small, too ill, but publicly, everyone said he was destined for greatness. And Charles, being a very polite baby, responded by refusing to grow properly. The problem with being a child king who can barely function, Philip IV died when Charles was just 3 years old. 3, and so Spain found itself with a toddler monarch who could barely stand unaided. Naturally, this meant his mother Mariana of Austria took over as regent. She was competent enough, at least compared to the men around her, who were deeply committed to making everything worse. Ministers plotted, factions formed, foreign ambassadors hovered like vultures wearing lace collars. Meanwhile, Charles sat quietly in the background, growing slower and sicker. He was present, technically, alive, technically, but he played no active role in his kingdom besides unintentionally fueling intrigue. Whenever ministers wanted power, they claimed they were the only ones who truly cared for Charles. Whenever rivals challenged them, they said the other side was responsible for his declining health, which is a polite, diplomatic way of saying, you poisoned the king, even when no one had the energy to poison him. And Charles, well, he just tried to stay upright. The Habsburg jaw, a legend in its final form. Let's drift for a moment to Charles's iconic feature, his jaw. The Habsburg jaw had been evolving over generations like some sort of aristocratic Peckerman, and Charles was its final evolution. It was massive, protruding, and completely unhelpful. Contemporaries said he could barely close his mouth fully. Eating was slow and exhausting. Speech was difficult, and portraits, real ones, not the heavily edited royal propagandish, showed a young man whose face looked permanently confused by its own geometry. His skull was elongated, his tongue oversized, his teeth badly misaligned. He resembled a sad, sleep-deprived pelican, which is honestly perfect for a bedtime story. Education. Sort of, you might think a fragile child king would receive the best tutors in Europe. He did not. His education mostly involved priests telling him he needed to pray harder. If he prayed enough, they insisted, he would grow stronger, which is not how biology works. But the Habsburgs weren't big on that. So Charles grew up, sheltered, devout, and painfully naive. Historians note he remained childlike well into adulthood, gentle, passive, and confused by the political storms around him. He wasn't stupid. He was just catastrophically unprepared for reality. Every time someone asked him to make a decision, he reacted the same way you do when Netflix asks, "Are you still watching?" with a tired, bewildered stare that suggested he wished someone else would decide for him. Let's drift into his early reign. Slowly, like his government as Charles entered his teens, Spain's problems multiplied: war, debt, corruption, plagues, a general sense that the entire country needed a nap. His regent mother fought to keep power, constantly battling ministers and nobles who whispered that Spain's salvation depended on removing her. And of course, everyone blamed Charles's health for their own failures. If harvests failed, it was a sign the king was cursed. If a treaty collapsed, it was because Charles wasn't praying enough. If the weather was too humid, probably France's fault. But Charles was somehow involved. Charles shuffled through court ceremonies, pale and exhausted, barely able to stand during long rituals. Foreign envoys reported he looked as if he might fall apart at any moment. Yet somehow, he lived. He kept going. Slow, fragile, but stubbornly alive. A medical marvel held together by faith, royal willpower, and possibly pure spite. His first marriage, an attempt at dynastic hope in 1679. Charles married Marie-Louise of Orleans. She was vibrant, intelligent, and unfortunately tasked with the impossible job of producing an heir with a man whose family tree had already declared biological bankruptcy. Marie-Louise tried. She genuinely liked Charles. She even brought a tiny spark of life to the court, filling it with music, color, and the faint smell of French perfume. But Charles was weak. Their marriage was affectionate but strained by his health, physical limitations, and the crushing pressure placed on both of them. And of course, no children followed. Court gossip blamed everything imaginable: witchcraft, France, the Queen's supposed coldness, Charles's supposed bewitchment. They blamed the stars, they blamed diet, they blamed bad omens, comets, and the occasional unlucky priest. No one blamed inbreeding. Obviously, decline, but make it soft and slow by his 20s. Charles's symptoms worsened. He suffered from chronic intestinal problems. He grew weaker, his speech slurred. He had tremors. He couldn't digest food properly. His limbs grew thin while his abdomen swollen. But still, he held on. Foreign ambassadors kept sending long, dramatic reports predicting he'd die any minute. Spanish ministers drafted succession plans constantly. Astrologers worked overtime, and Charles continued attending Mass, shuffling through ceremonies like a very tired ghost in embroidered silk. The tragedy, wrapped in velvet, Charles II lived his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from him: power, influence, access, control. He trusted easily. He believed advisors who lied to him. He believed exorcists who claimed they could cure him. He believed priests who insisted Spain's survival depended on how hard he prayed. He bore this weight quietly, almost timidly, a king who had the responsibility of an empire but the health of a flickering candle. And through it all, he tried. He tried to be dutiful. He tried to be pious. He tried to be what his kingdom needed, but he was simply too sick, too fragile, too cursed by his own ancestry. His reign was slow, unsteady, and filled with gentle sadness, and empire fading along with him. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, impressive. If you're drifting, even better. Tonight, we continue floating through the dim, heavy atmosphere of late Habsburg Spain. As Charles II inches further into adulthood, illness, and political chaos, let's keep everything soft, slow, and slightly amused at how spectacularly dysfunctional royal courts could be. A kingdom watching, waiting, whispers growing as Charles passed into his mid-20s. Spain entered a strange state of permanent anticipation. Everyone knew the king was unlikely to survive long. Everyone knew he had no heir, and everyone knew the death of this fragile monarch would detonate Europe like a badly wired chandelier. Foreign ambassadors hovered around Madrid with the same energy as relatives waiting for the reading of a will, trying, very subtly of course, to claim a future slice of Spain's enormous empire. France wanted influence. Austria wanted everything. The smaller powers wanted the seas to calm down for 5 minutes. And Spain desperately wanted a miracle. But miracles, unfortunately, were in short supply. Marie-Louise's silent struggle, a queen with no good options. Charles's first wife, Marie-Louise, tried her best to bring warmth to a court that felt perpetually cold. She brought French fashion, laughter, a little charm, and the revolutionary idea that perhaps the palace windows could be opened occasionally. But the pressure on her was suffocating. Every month without a royal pregnancy deepened the court's panic. Midwives scrutinized her, priests lectured her, rumor-mongers invented wild stories. Some said she secretly ate chocolate that blocked fertility. Others claimed her enemies fed her potions that stopped fertility. A few blamed witches, because naturally witches always made excellent scapegoats in boring political crises. Marie-Louise grew thin from stress. She fainted often. She suffered from stomach pains that sound suspiciously like anxiety, malnutrition, and sheer dread of disappointing an entire empire. And Charles, he adored her in his exhausted, bewildered way. But affection alone couldn't overcome biology. Their marriage remained childless. And then, quite suddenly, Marie-Louise died in 1689 at only 26 years old. Officially, it was appendicitis. Unofficially, people whispered she had been poisoned, or bewitched, or starved, or cursed. The truth was probably far simpler. A young woman crushed by expectation and poor health in a palace where medicine was more superstition than science. Charles was devastated. He cried openly, something no Spanish monarch was supposed to do. For weeks he refused to attend ceremonies. He wandered the palace halls, pale and hollow-eyed, muttering prayers under his breath, and for the first time, the court truly feared losing him as well. A new marriage, because Europe needed an heir, desperately. Within months, political necessity dragged Charles into a second marriage. He married Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess with a famously large and politically useful family. She had 23 siblings, which meant her fertility was a selling point. She arrived in Spain fully aware of her mission: produce an heir and save the dynasty. Maria Anna was confident, energetic, and extremely opinionated, three qualities that clashed with everything about Charles's slow, uncertain nature. She tried to impose German routines on the Spanish court, which went about as well as replacing a candle with a wet potato. She was also deeply suspicious, convinced enemies lurked behind every tapestry, so she doubled the palace guard and tripled the exorcisms. Because yes, we're redrifting now into the era where Charles II's escort embraced full supernatural panic. The Bewitched, a king diagnosed by fear by the 1690s, Charles's health deteriorated at a hypnotically slow pace. He suffered from tremors, chronic infections, swollen limbs, digestive collapse, partial paralysis episodes, fainting spells, horrible insomnia, and a level of fatigue that made him look, according to one ambassador, half alive, half departed. His hair fell out in clumps, his voice weakened. He lost so much weight that his clothes hung like empty curtains. His eyesight dimmed, leaving him staring blankly at the world, like someone trying to interpret a blurry painting. Doctors had no explanation, so naturally, the court assumed sorcery. Priests, exorcists, miracle workers, and alleged demon hunters streamed into the palace. They prayed over him, they sprinkled holy water, they burned herbs, they recited chants that probably scared the servants more than the demons they were meant to repel. One exorcist claimed Charles was possessed by a dead sorcerer hiding in his stomach. Another insisted someone had cursed his underclothes. Someone else blamed France. Of course, Charles endured all this quietly, too exhausted to protest, too devout to doubt, and too gentle to blame anyone. He truly believed he was bewitched. It was heartbreaking and deeply symbolic of a dynasty clinging to superstition because reality was too embarrassing to admit. The political freefall Europe takes a number. While Charles slowly deteriorated, political factions sharpened their claws like bored cats. Spain split into two camps. The pro-French faction led by nobles who hoped marrying into the French Bourbon line would save Spain from isolation. They wanted Louis XIV's grandson to inherit the throne, a plan that made Austria very nervous. The pro-Austrian faction led by Maria Anna herself, who insisted only the Habsburgs could rule Spain properly. Conveniently, this kept power tied to her family. The arguing was endless. Meetings dragged on for hours. Ministers pretended to care about Spain's strategic cliff stability, but everyone knew they were really choosing whichever heir would give them the best chance at keeping their job. And in the middle of this political hurricane stood Charles, blinking slowly, trying to understand diplomatic memos written in elegant handwriting he could barely see. He prayed constantly. He hoped for guidance. He waited for clarity. None came, just more illness and more paperwork, a body failing, one organ at a time. As Charles approached his 30s, which was ancient by his standards, his body began shutting down like a lantern losing oil. He suffered from edema. His legs swelled painfully. He could barely walk. His heart weakened. His breath grew short and cracking. He lost what little strength he had left. He also became infertile, profoundly so, which the court refused to believe. Instead, they blamed Maria Anna. They blamed her German advisors. They accused her of withholding an heir deliberately. The Queen retaliated by commissioning more exorcisms. At one point, she summoned a priest who convinced Charles that witches were stealing his semen in the night, a statement that tells you everything you need to know about 17th century science. But even Charles, in his dazed gentleness, eventually realized something deeper was wrong. He whispered once to a confidant, "I am dying," not dramatically, not fearfully, just stating a quiet fact. His decline was slow, soft, and unbearably sad. Europe holds its breath. The coming succession crisis by 1699. It was clear Charles couldn't hold on much longer. His body barely functioned. His mind drifted in and out of clarity. He spent days in bed, curtains drawn, the palace dark except for candles that flickered against carved wooden ceilings. He weighed less than many teenagers. His hair had thinned almost completely. His skin took on a pale, waxy look, the look of a man whose bloodline had run out of time. Foreign ambassadors reported that he looked like a corpse who occasionally sat up out of courtesy. And yet the question of succession remained unresolved. The Austrian candidate, the French candidate, a third candidate no one liked but kept suggesting out of habit. Europe tiptoed around the question like it might explode, because it would. The moment Charles died, war was inevitable. But Charles wasn't thinking about global politics. He was thinking about his soul. A final attempt at salvation, the last exorcisms in his final months. Charles underwent a series of dramatic exorcisms ordered by Maria, Anna, and approved by desperate ministers. Witnesses described scenes worthy of a medieval drama. Priests chanting over the king's bed, candles sputtering Charles, trembling violently, attendants weeping. Incense filling the room so thickly it burned the eyes. An exorcist declared he had found multiple demons within the king, including those sent by dead bed relatives and malicious French agents. Another insisted that a witch had cursed the king using a toad buried under the palace floor. And still, Charles lay there, frail as parchment, clinging to scraps of hope. But nothing changed. His illness was not demonic, it was genetic. Centuries of dynasty-preserving marriages had left him with a body that could no longer function. He accepted it quietly. The final days, a candle in the dark. On November 1st, 1700, All Saints' Day, Charles II died at age 38. His last words were a prayer, soft, simple, resigned. The autopsy, performed by terrified surgeons who expected to find evidence of witchcraft, revealed instead a body ravaged by congenital disease. His heart was the size of a walnut, his lungs deteriorated, his stomach and intestines were nearly fused. He had only one functioning testicle, and even that was malformed. His blood was described as black and thick, as cold tar, a lifetime of fragility laid bare. The dynasty ended with him. The Spanish Habsburg line, once mighty, finally collapsed, and Europe plunged instantly into the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped the continent for centuries, all because one sick, gentle king lived a life he never chose. Hey everyone, welcome back. Settle in, loosen the shoulders. If your blanket is sliding away, pull it up. Yes, that's better. Tonight, we keep drifting through those wide, endless northern plains, where winter doesn't politely knock. It simply arrives, sits down, and refuses to leave. Last time, we wandered through the basics of how Tipis worked, how the wind hummed through the poles, how buffalo hides whispered under moonlight. Now, let's drift deeper into daily life, into movement, into survival decisions made slowly, carefully, and with the kind of quiet wisdom that cold landscapes naturally teach. So let's float onward, into the routines, customs, and soft midnight world inside a tipi at -30 degrees Celsius, where the world was white, but life was warm. Imagine the morning, not the loud, modern morning, with phones buzzing, no. A slow dawn on the northern plains, snow stretching out like a blank sheet, the air still as a held breath, a silence so complete it felt like a living thing. Inside the tipi, though, the atmosphere was a different universe, warm, dim, soft, smoke curling lazily toward the smoke hole, embers glowing like sleepy red eyes, buffalo hides insulating the walls, the fire crackling with that reassuring, "Lo, I'm still here" sound. People didn't rush, they didn't leap out of bed. They unfurled themselves from buffalo robes, one limb at a time. Because in that kind of cold, Sudden enthusiasm was a luxury reserved for summer. Children stayed cocooned, blinking at the faint morning light filtering through the smoke flap. Elders stretched slowly, joints negotiating with the universe, and the adults whose job it was to rekindle the fire did so with a calm, habitual rhythm that came from years of doing it before sunrise. Outside, -30°C waited. Inside, it was a small pocket of humanity glowing gently in a world made of ice. Fire tending an art form more than a chore. Keeping a fire alive at -30°C was not a task. It was closer to a pact, a negotiation with the elements, a promise you couldn't break. In the winter camps, someone always slept close to the fire. Not right beside it that was smoky and unpleasant, but close enough to catch the fading light with half-open eyes. When the fire dimmed, they would quietly add wood or buffalo chips, the fuel that burned long and steady without exploding into sparks. There was a rhythm to it. Lift the flap slightly, let the cold air nibble at the coals, place the next piece of fuel, wait for the flame to catch, pull the flap back down. No rush, no sudden movements. The tipi breathed with the fire. People say architecture is about walls and roofs, but for the Plains tribes, architecture was breath. The tipi inhaled through the lower flaps and exhaled through the smoke hole. When it functioned perfectly, the flame burned clean and bright, and the air inside stayed fresh even with snow piling outside. There was warmth, yes, but also life, movement, and that gentle reassurance that the cold was not the ruler of this space. Cooking in winter meals that smelled like survival meals made in a tipi during deep winter weren't grand feasts. They were slow, practical, comforting. The smell of boiling meat was common buffalo, mostly, but also deer, elk, or whatever had been dried for winter. The scent drifted upward, mixing with the smoke, settling into the hides until everything inside, from clothing to sleeping robes, carried the faint aroma of survival. One of the most important foods was pemmican, a miracle of nutrition that explorers later pretended they invented. It was simple, dried powdered meat, rendered fat berries sometimes packed tightly for storage. It lasted months. You could eat it cold or heat it into a stew, a winter lifesaver. There was something softly poetic about these meals. In a world where temperatures could freeze exposed skin in minutes, food wasn't just energy, it was a message. We're still here. We're still warm. We will see another sunrise. Clothing the quiet armor against the cold inside a tipi. People layered clothing depending on the fire. But stepping outside required a transformation. The cold demanded respect, or at least cooperation. Buffalo robes, so heavy they felt like wearing a calm, sleeping animal. Moccasins lined with fur. Leggings wrapped tightly. Hooded cloaks that kept the wind from sneaking in. Everything fit loosely enough to trap warm air, but tightly enough not to flap open like a flag of surrender. There was a certain dignity to winter clothing, a softness in the fur, a heaviness that made movement deliberate, a silence that matched the landscape. Even children wore miniature versions, so cute and bundled that they resembled tiny walking bison. Clothing wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It said, the cold doesn't win today. Daily chores, nothing was done quickly. When the temperature is -30°C, speed becomes a myth. Fetching snow to melt for water took time. Checking the horses took time. Repairing sleds, checking tools, scraping hides, all done at a slow, steady pace. But this slowness wasn't laziness, it was wisdom. Moving too fast in extreme cold makes you sweat, and sweat is one of winter's deadliest companions. Sweat freezes, wet clothing kills. So everything became a drifting rhythm, step, breath, in harmony with the land. Inside the tipi, chores continued. Patching clothing, making new moccasins, boiling water, checking arrow points, mending damaged gear, brushing snow from furs. People worked with their hands in that calm, focused way that comes naturally when the world outside is quiet. There was no impatience, no rush. Time itself felt thick and slow. Nighttime, The quietest time of all night in winter was long, deep, heavy. The fire dimmed to embers, but never fully died. Someone always added a small piece of fuel before sleeping, just enough to keep the glow alive. Families slept in a circle, feet toward the fire, heads pointed outward like petals around a warm center. Buffalo robes were layered thickly. When the wind outside howled, the tipi poles creaked softly, not dangerously, just conversationally. Children sometimes woke up confused by the cold. Someone would gently pull a robe over them. No rushing, just calm, half asleep kindness. There were stories, 2 quiet ones, told in low voices so the dark didn't feel alone. Stories of old winters, stories of animals, stories of great hunts, gentle spirits, and ancestors who watched from the sky. Nothing loud, nothing frightening, just drifting tales that lulled listeners back to sleep. This, more than anything, made the tipi a real home. Not the fire, not the hides, not the engineering, but the shared warmth of voices moving through the night. Moving camp, a slow dance across the frozen plains despite the cold. Tribes still moved during winter when needed, to find better grazing for horses, to follow herds, or to avoid storms. Moving camp in winter was a careful process. The fire was allowed to die with dignity. Hides were taken down slowly, so they didn't crack in the cold. Poles were bundled together for dogs or horses to drag. Snow was packed down to create paths for walking. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't rushed. It was a quiet migration, a drifting across white distances that seemed endless. Tipis were incredibly portable. A skilled pair of women could pack up a home in under an hour, even in winter. And when they arrived at the next camp, the new tipi went up just as quickly. Poles raised in a tripod, more poles added in a rotation, hides wrapped around, and tightened smoke flap adjusted fire rekindled a new circle of warmth in a cold world. Community, the real heat source. People sometimes assumed the tipi was the source of warmth. And yes, the hides, the poles, the engineering were all impressive, but the real warmth came from community. Winter camps were close-knit clusters, tipis arranged in protective rings, paths stomped through snow from one fire to another, shared meals, shared stories, shared protection against storms. Children played in the snow, shrieking with that unstoppable joy that even -30°C cannot extinguish. Elders sat together exchanging memories. Hunters planned routes, women coordinated chores. Everyone had a role, and every role mattered. In the long nights, this togetherness was everything. Inside the tipi, family was the flame. Outside, the community was the glowing coals that never fully went dark. People didn't survive winter because they had good architecture. They survived because they had each other. The soft, inevitable return of spring-winter on the plains felt eternal, until suddenly it wasn't. The air softened one morning, just a little, a hint of warmth brushing past the snow. Birds grew louder. The horses stomped more energetically, and inside the tipi, people woke to a slightly brighter light filtering through the hides. Things changed gradually. Fires burned a little smaller, clothing got a bit lighter, chores became easier, laughter came more often, footsteps sped up, snow melted into thick patches of mud, and soon the winter stories were packed away like tools to be taken out next season. The tipi remained the same shape, the same structure, but the world around it shifted into green, and life resumed its warm weather rhythm. But no matter the season, the tipi held memory, the quiet winter nights, the drifting stories, the patience of cold months lived gently instead of fearfully. Let's drift a little further into the winter village now. The snow has settled, the chimney smoke has thickened, and everyone, young, old, important, or barely awake, is doing exactly what people always do in winter, trying to survive it without losing their toes or their patience. The medieval winter wasn't a dramatic Hollywood blizzard. It was quieter, slower, a season where everything softened except the work. Ironically, that only got harder. So let us wander slowly through the household and see what everyone was doing with their short days, long nights, and general sense of, well, we're stuck here until spring. Women, winter's quiet commanders. Women did not get winter off, because of course they didn't. Their day started before dawn, when the inside of the cottage felt only slightly warmer than the outside, and usually with a fire that had died out overnight. Restarting it wasn't optional. It was the medieval version of turning the house back on. Once warmth sputtered back into existence, the winter tasks began drifting in one by one. Indoor work becomes everything. With no fields to weed or crops to tend, indoor tasks took over, spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth very slowly, in a rhythm that could put anyone to sleep except the person doing it, mending clothing that had been worn a bit too enthusiastically during the year, preserving and rationing food so the family didn't run out by February, brewing weak winter ale because water alone was a gamble and sobriety wasn't fashionable, caring for children who, thanks to winter boredom, managed to make twice the mess while doing half as much. Women also handled cooking, which in winter meant turning the same limited ingredients into something edible without anyone noticing they'd eaten the same stew for 6 weeks. If they were lucky, a few dried apples or salted meat appeared. If not, the stew became more interpretive. Social wintering. Winter also created something you might call medieval socializing, meaning sitting together, talking very quietly, not spending energy unless absolutely necessary, and sharing gossip that had been aging like cheese since autumn-winter. Gossip traveled slowly, but with great dedication. Men, winter's tired workhorses. Men did not exactly get a holiday either. Sure, the fields slept, but winter had its own list of chores, mostly involving things breaking, freezing, or refusing to work because of the weather. Maintenance season. Much of a man's winter was fixing things that broke in the months when you were too busy to fix them. This included repairing tools, because spring would demand them, sharpening blades and axes, mending fences chewed by livestock or weakened by weather, checking the roof for leaks, splitting firewood endlessly, because warmth was the only luxury no one could skip. Firewood was a constant task, a never-ending task, a task that expanded to fill all available time, like a medieval version of email. Animal care. Livestock survived winter thanks to constant attention. Cows needed feeding, sheltering, and passive encouragement. Sheep had to be kept from freezing or wandering off in a moment of woolly confusion. Horses required grooming and warmed water. Chickens had to be frightened back into laying eggs, which they stubbornly refused to do in winter. Men also handled butchering, usually in early winter, to stockpile meat for the cold months. It was unpleasant work, but medieval life did not operate on a vegetarian difficulty setting. Community obligations. Winter also meant helping repair communal structures, attending meetings about village concerns, taking turns guarding stored grain, listening to the reeve talk far longer than anyone wished. Men were busy, but in a sleepy, trudging sort of way, constant motion without much excitement. Elders, winter's quiet memory keepers. Elders were not expected to chop wood or fix roofs. They had already earned the right to sit closer to the fire than anyone else. Their main jobs were twofold: stay warm, pass down knowledge no one wrote down. Winter gave them time for storytelling, family histories, local legends, strange warnings that began with "when I was your age," and occasionally advice that made sense only after you'd lived long enough to appreciate it. They also helped with small tasks: sorting dried herbs, twisting cord, watching children, and giving commentary on how everyone else was doing their work incorrectly. Elders were the slow, steady heartbeat of the home, quiet, thoughtful, and mildly judgmental. Children, winter's restless shadows. Children were not idle in winter. That honor did not belong to medieval children. Their work might include gathering small firewood, helping feed animals, bringing water after ice-breaking duty, carding wool, sorting beans, lentils, or anything else that needed sorting, sweeping floors that somehow got dirty despite no one going outside. But children also had bursts of idle winter energy that made them chase each other through cramped rooms, create small arguments for warmth, and play simple games that older relatives tolerated but did not understand. Education, or something like it, formal schooling, was rare. So winter became a season for learning crafts, practicing little skills, imitating adults, and doing small chores that doubled as life lessons, whether the children realized it or not. Mostly, the winter made children cling to the fire, eyes half open, fidgeting just enough to remind everyone they existed. The home moving in slow motion. Winter life was a quiet choreography. Women weaving in a warm corner, men entering with cold air following like an uninvited guest, children hovering near the fire, elders wrapped in wool, muttering advice, a pot simmering something humble but hot, a dog that somehow always got the warmest spot. No one spoke loudly, no one rushed. The world outside had paused, so the world inside moved gently, like a dream you could half remember. Winter was harsh, yes, but it also brought the rare gift of stillness, days when the village simply breathed together. And as we drift onward, let's follow that slow rhythm into the next part, where the night deepens and winter rituals, beliefs, and little superstitions begin to glow quietly in the dim light. Winter always changed people, not in dramatic, life-altering ways, but in small, quiet shifts, like how they walked a little slower, spoke a little softer, and glanced over their shoulders a little more often once the sun dropped behind the frosted tree line. The medieval world believed winter nights were well crowded, not by people, because everyone sensible was indoors, but by other things, older things, things you didn't talk about unless the fire was very bright, or unless someone else brought it up first. So as the long nights settled, so did rituals, beliefs, and those little superstitions that no one admitted to taking seriously, while secretly doing everything possible to follow them. Let's drift into that midnight world, where winter made even the bravest villagers whisper. The fire, the heart that must not die. The first and most sacred winter rule was simple. The fire must never go out. Not because people feared the cold, though they absolutely did, but because an extinguished hearth was an invitation to spirits, wanderers, misfortune, and whatever else crouched in the unseen corners of the season. Keeping the fire alive was a soft, nightly ritual, adding one last log, blowing gently on the embers, whispering a tiny hope that it would still be glowing at dawn. Some families even believed that the fire had moods. A crackling, lively fire meant protection. A low one meant someone in the house had annoyed the ancestors, probably by complaining about dinner again. And if the fire went out during a blizzard, well, no one said it out loud, but everyone thought the same thing. This is how ghost stories begin. The long night visitors, winter nights, were associated with quiet visitors, the sort villagers never fully agreed upon, but the consensus was they were not human, and they preferred not to be seen. 1. The restless spirits of the cold. Cold was not just weather, it was a creature. People believed that icy drafts slipping under the door were spirits passing through. You weren't supposed to chase them away, to harshly, just politely block the gap and pretend you didn't notice. And if you felt a chill on the back of your neck, someone older would simply say, "Don't turn round, it'll go away," comforting. 2. The winter wanderer. Every region had its own version of the winter wanderer. A lost traveler, a vengeful spirit, a frozen soul searching for warmth, or simply an omen that someone in the village had annoyed the wrong supernatural entity. If a faint knock sounded outside on a stormy night, families froze quiet, listening, waiting. No one answered. No one opened the door. No one even breathed loudly. The wanderer, they said, fed on invitations. Winter taught good boundaries long before modern culture tried. 3. The unnamed things in the woods. The woods were alive in winter, not in an "isn't nature beautiful" sense, but in an absolutely "do not walk out there after sunset" sense. Children were told stories of white shapes moving between trees, footprints that appeared but never returned, whispers that carried on the wind, eyes that reflected torchlight but belonged to no known animal. Some adults insisted it was superstition. Those same adults made sure the shutters were bolted before dark. Household rituals for protection. Winter turned every home into a small fortress, not in structure, but in intention. Families had an assortment of rituals to protect against the season's more imaginative threats. Hanging evergreen branches. Evergreens were winter's lucky charm. They symbolized life that refused to die. People hung pine branches, sprigs of yew, clumps of holly, not as decoration, but as spiritual insulation. It was the medieval equivalent of saying, "This house is taken." No ghosts, no wandering souls, and absolutely no woodland creatures that think they're human. Thank you. Salt at the door. Salt was expensive, but winter justified the expense. A pinch at the doorway, a small line across the threshold. Not enough to waste, but enough to say, kindly stay on your side of reality. The night bread offering. In some villages, a small piece of bread was left near the hearth at night, not for mice, not for the dog, but for whatever passed through the home, offering hospitality without allowing entry. Elders claimed the spirits respected polite homes more than rude ones, which, when you think about it, is a fairly reasonable social system. The winter story circles, with long nights and nowhere to go. Storytelling became the medieval version of entertainment, therapy, and insomnia management all at once. Winter stories were divided into three categories. 1. The cautionary ones. These usually involved disobedient children, unfortunate travelers, farmers who ignored winter signs, and an unfortunate encounter with either spirits or nature. Cautionary tales always ended with someone learning a valuable lesson, or, more honestly, with someone not surviving long enough to. 2. The ancestral ones. These were gentler, softer stories about long-dead family members, ancient events, the time great-grandfather fought a goose and lost, or that distant cousin who claimed to see angels, or possibly large insects. These stories slowed the night, made winter feel older than the village itself. 3. The funny ones. In a dry medieval way, medieval humor was subtle, sometimes too subtle, but winter nights produced stories about town mishaps, clerical blunders, fights between neighbors over ridiculous things, marriages that began poorly and improved only slightly. Laughter, even quiet laughter, warmed a cold room better than firewood. Winter dreams and night fears. Long nights meant long dreams, painfully vivid ones. People believed winter dreams carried messages. Dreams of running meant coming. Hardship dreams of birds meant change. Dreams of teeth falling out meant illness. Dreams of warmth meant protection. Dreams of nothing meant you had slept deeply enough to impress the ancestors. But winter also brought night fears. Those moments when a gust of wind sounded suspiciously like a whisper, or when a creaking wall seemed to sigh. People didn't call it fear. They called it winter thinking, which was code for I'm not scared, but I'm also not getting out of bed until sunrise. The role of sound in winter nights. Winter nights had a soundtrack, the cracking of ice, the groaning of wooden beams, the distant howl of wolves, the snap of a log collapsing in the fire, the soft breathing of animals in the barn, the occasional mysterious thud. No one could explain. People listened to these sounds like they were messages. Some were comforting, some were warnings, some were simply unfamiliar enough to encourage everyone to stay very still and pretend they hadn't heard anything. Watching the stars when the sky cleared down. It didn't often. Families stepped outside to look at the stars, not for scientific reasons, but for reassurance. Winter skies were painfully clear, and the constellations seemed almost too close. People felt both small and protected under them, as if the sky itself were keeping watch. Some believed certain stars brightened during hard winters. Others believed the dead walked among the constellations, flickering gently. Looking up made the cold seem ancient, not hostile. It turned the season from something endured into something shared. Community nights, winter's quiet togetherness. Sometimes whole families visited each other at night, carrying lanterns that flickered wildly in the wind. Gatherings included Shared meals, bread dipped in hot broth, warm ale, quiet singing prayer, and long, slow conversations that drifted like smoke to the rafters. People didn't talk about happiness, they talked about surviving, which, in winter, was more or less the same thing. The village felt smaller, tighter, held together by necessity and comfort instead of crops and work. Superstitions that shaped the season. Winter superstition was like invisible wallpaper, always present, rarely acknowledged. Some common beliefs included: never whistle at night. It called things you didn't want to meet. Never sweep after sunset. It brushed away good spirits. Don't spin wool on certain nights. It angered household guardians. Leave water uncovered. Spirits needed something to drink. Never sleep with your feet toward the door. It invited the cold to take you. People followed these rules not out of fear, but out of habit, the way modern people avoid walking under ladders or opening umbrellas indoors. Superstition turned winter into something structured, predictable, less lonely. The quiet philosophy of winter nights. There was a strange peace in winter nights, a kind of acceptance. People knew there were limits to what they could control. The cold, the dark illness, spirits, fate, or the amount of firewood their children had mysteriously misplaced. But winter encouraged a softer type of resilience. Stay warm, stay together, keep the fire alive, and wait for dawn. However long it takes. It was survival, yes, but it was also community at its most intimate. Winter nights were when the medieval world sighed, slowed down, and permitted itself to simply exist. Nothing more, nothing less. Winter was not just a season, it was a test, a long, quiet exam in which the medieval world was graded on preparedness, patience, and the ability to not run out of firewood because someone thought the pile looked big enough. Every household, from the poorest hut to the more comfortable longhouse, relied on a web of small but essential tricks, practical, clever, sometimes slightly questionable, just to make winter survivable. Tonight, let's drift through those survival tools and everyday winter hacks. No drama, just the slow, reassuring rhythm of ingenuity in a cold, patient world. Food storage, the art of making things last longer than they should. Food in winter wasn't about flavor, it was about endurance. A medieval family survived on a carefully calculated combination of preserved meats, stored grains, root vegetables that refused to die, dried berries, and whatever the animals produced, assuming the animals felt generous. But behind every item in the winter pantry was a tiny saga. 1. Meat preservation, salt, smoke, and hope. Salted meat was the king of winter food, but also the monarch most likely to disappoint everyone at dinner. People didn't eat salted meat because they loved it. They ate it because it survived longer than they would. Smoking meat was another winter tradition. Strips hung above a slow fire, smoke rising into the rafters, the smell traveling through the house, dogs staring up with heartbreaking optimism. The result was meat that tasted like the inside of a chimney but lasted for months. A small culinary victory. 2. The winter legends of root vegetables. Carrots, turnips, beets, parsnips. These were winter's stubborn soldiers. They stored well, they grew underground, which felt symbolic, and they appeared in almost every winter meal, no matter how much the family pretended to be excited about them. Children developed strong opinions about root vegetables. Adults quietly agreed. Turnips especially had a reputation. Reliable, tough, not particularly exciting, much like certain medieval nobles. 3. Grain storage. The lifeline grains were stored in wooden chests, clay vessels, woven baskets, sealed pits, and sometimes under beds, because medieval people understood priorities. But grains attracted visitors, tiny ones, which is why winter homes had an ongoing, understated war with mice, rats, bold mice and rats, who had far too much confidence. Cats were valued winter companions, not for affection, but for their enthusiasm for resolving these conflicts. Drying and saving everything. The medieval winter motto might as well have been, if it can be dried, dry it. If it can be smoked, smoke it. If it can be buried, bury it. Nothing was wasted. Apples and berries, strung from rafters like oddly sweet ornaments. Dried apples tasted like leather, but good leather, useful leather. Leather that got you through January. Herbs and medicinals hung in bunches. Sage, rosemary, thyme, nettles, yarrow, and a few mystery herbs. Only the healer understood their job. Make bland winter meals slightly less tragic, and treat winter colds that refused to leave. Cheese, the miraculous winter friend cheese, was an emotional support food. It stored, it traveled, it came in wheels, which felt impressive, and it was one of the few foods that brought actual joy to winter meals. Some cheeses aged into something delightful, some aged into something concerning, but all were eaten anyway. Water, a surprisingly complicated problem. Winter water wasn't just cold, it was frozen. Fetching water meant breaking surface ice, dealing with frozen buckets, or if things were truly miserable, melting snow, which was notoriously inefficient and tasted faintly of disappointment. 1. The ice-breaking ritual. Some families had a morning winter routine. Break the ice on the river, fill the buckets quickly, and get out before toes and fingers staged a rebellion. People claimed to get used to it. They didn't. They simply accepted it. 2. Snow as drinking water. Snow was clean, technically, but melting it was an exercise in patience. You needed heat, time, and enough snow to fill a pot 12 times. Because snow collapses into nothing the moment it gets even slightly warm. Still, snow water saved lives, and occasionally tasted faintly like pine needles, ash, or something we're not going to ask about. 3. Collecting roof drips. Roofs leaked. It was inevitable. Annoying in summer, but in winter, technically helpful. Families placed pots under dripping spots to catch meltwater. It was both a solution and a reminder that your roof needed work. Firecraft, the winter skill everyone needed. Fire was more than heat. It was life, protection, light, cooking, morale, spiritual comfort, and an excellent excuse to sit for long periods doing absolutely nothing. 1. Starting the fire, a delicate ritual most families used. Flint and steel, dried birch, bark, pine resin, and whatever small twigs the children didn't break by accident. The first spark of the morning was a quiet victory, a reassurance that winter hadn't won yet. 2. The sacred embers. People guarded embers like treasure. If the fire died completely, starting it again took time and wasted energy the family didn't have. So they preserved the embers under ash bark, clay pots, or the watchful gaze of someone who took fire maintenance very seriously. 3. The wood debate. Every winter household had at least one heated argument about firewood. You're burning the good logs too fast. Those are for January. Why is the pile smaller than yesterday? I swear I only took 2 pieces. Firewood was rationed like gold. Except gold didn't keep your fingers attached. Indoor winter technology in the loosest sense. Medieval winter ingenuity was simple, but effective. These were the quiet hacks that made life survivable. 1. The sleeping pile. People slept together in one giant shared pile of humanity. Blankets, furs, and the occasional annoyed sheep. It wasn't about love, it was about warmth. Human beings were heating systems long before radiators. 2. Extra curtains made of anything available. Curtains were crafted from worn cloaks, old blankets, animal hides. Linen patched more times than anyone cared to count. They hung over windows and doors to block drafts, and occasionally blocked conversation when someone needed privacy, which was rare. 3. Straw as insulation. Straw was everywhere. Under blankets stuffed inside clothing, lining beds packed into wall gaps, spread on floors. It sounded crunchy, smelled slightly barn-like, worked like a charm. 4. Stones that warmed the bed. People heated stones near the fire and tucked them into the bedding. It was the medieval version of a hot water bottle. Effective, portable, occasionally painful if rolled onto by accident. Clothing. Layering. Before it was trendy, medieval clothing in winter was all about layers, not for style, but for pure survival. 1. The woolen base layer. Scratchy, reliable, responsible for 70% of medieval winter comfort and 90% of medieval itching. 2. Outer garments, cloaks made of wool, fur, heavy linen, whatever could be stitched into a wearable shape. Some cloaks had hoods, some didn't. All made people look vaguely heroic or vaguely exhausted. 3. Footwear that tried its best. Shoes were stuffed with straw, fur scraps, cloth leaves. The last remains of hope. Snow got inside anyway, but warm toes were considered a luxury, not a right. Animal care. Winter's silent partnership. Animals were not livestock, they were co-survivors. Their warmth filled barns, their breath fogged the air, their presence kept spirits, wolves, and loneliness at bay. 1. The night watch over animals. Medieval families checked on animals constantly. Cows for warmth, sheep for wool, horses for travel, goats for milk, chickens for eggs. Though they frequently went on winter strike, animals were fed more than usual, because hungry animals made sad sounds that no one wanted to hear on long nights. 2. Barn heat. Barns were warmer than some homes. Families sometimes slept near the animals during the coldest nights. Not romantic, not glamorous, but undeniably practical. 3. Manure. As lifesaver, manure created heat. Large piles of it could warm soil, melt snow, and when mixed properly, help grow winter greens in small, protected garden spaces. Winter survival wasn't elegant, but it was effective. Psychology of winter survival. Quiet resilience. Winter shaped the medieval mind. People learned to save eagerly, share quietly, endure steadily, complain, rarely fear the cold, but also respect it, and find comfort in the small, warm spaces between storms. Winter survival wasn't heroic. It was gentle persistence. No grand battles, no dramatic triumphs, just families keeping fires alive, protecting food, caring for animals, and waiting for the first shy hint of spring. And yet, in these small acts lived the true strength of medieval life, the kind that didn't make it into chronicles, but kept everyone alive long enough to read them. If you've ever visited a modern grocery store at 2 a.m., the kind where the fluorescent lights hum louder than the customers, you might think medieval winter markets were similar. And in some ways, yes, strange lighting, very few people, and a general sense of why am I here, floating in the air. But in reality, winter markets were far more alive, far more dramatic, and far more essential to survival than any modern midnight shopping run. So tonight, as the snow settles softly on the roofs of our village, let's take a quiet walk together toward the winter marketplace, a place where necessity, scarcity, and very human creativity all meet in a small wooden square. The market begins before dawn. Winter markets didn't wait for sunlight. By the time the horizon glowed faintly silver, villagers were already trudging toward the square, carrying baskets, bundles, jars, and the occasional reluctant chicken. The cold made everyone move slower but think faster. If someone wasted time haggling too long, their toes would remind them that frostbite waits for no bargain. You could smell the market before you saw it. The sharp tempts of smoked meat, the earthy scent of root vegetables, the dusty sweetness of dried herbs, and the unmistakable aroma of wool that has definitely seen better days. It wasn't glamorous, but it was life. Silent trades, because sometimes talking is too much work. Not all winter trading was done with words. In some colder regions, a tradition called silent barter was surprisingly common. Imagine this: a villager places a basket of dried beans on a large flat stone. Then they step back. A second villager approaches, examines the beans, and places down something they think is of equal value, maybe a chunk of smoked fish or a small wool scarf. They step back. The first villager returns. If they approve, they take the offer. If they don't, they simply walk away and wait. No shouting, no by Thor a calm Caro, just quiet negotiation by proximity. Why silent trades? Because shouting wastes heat and breath and patience. Winter teaches diplomacy, whether you like it or not. The hidden economy, women at the center, while men often brought larger, bulkier goods, grain sacks, Firewood bundles. Tools. Women dominated the winter microeconomy. They traded embroidered cloth, mended gloves, herbal remedies, candles, jars of preserved berries, wool threads spun through long winter nights. These weren't luxury items, they were survival items. If someone ran out of candles in January, they didn't just sit in darkness for 6 weeks. They came to the winter market and found the woman who made them. In a world where resources froze, spoiled, or vanished, women became winter's quiet stabilizers, balancing shortages, managing exchanges, and ensuring everyone made it through to spring. Children, the unexpected market workers' children, of course, treated the market like an adventure. They ran small errands, carrying a neighbor's basket, helping arrange jars, holding a place in line, sprinkling sand on icy spots to prevent slips. For this they were often paid in tiny treasures: a dried apple slice, a warm chunk of bread, a carved wooden toy, or if they were very lucky, a rare honey drop. But children also acted as informal news carriers, because nothing travels faster in a medieval town than a child who heard something interesting. Old Thomas traded 3 whole turnips for a broken pot. He says the pot has a spirit inside it. The miller's wife has new herbs. She says they're from the forest, but nobody saw her go. Is any of it true? Probably not. But it made standing in the cold a little more entertaining. Elders' winters living libraries while younger people negotiated prices. The elders watched everything quietly from the edges of the square. They sat on low stools bundled in furs, eyes sharp despite the cold. To them, the market was not only commerce, it was memory. They remembered which families helped others in hard winters, which traders watered down ale, who was honest, who owed whom, who had survived which storms, and who had never learned from past mistakes. If you wanted to know whether a deal was fair, you didn't ask the merchant, you asked the elder sitting 30 feet away, and they would lift an eyebrow, slow and subtle, meaning, yes, you may buy from him, or tap their cane once on the ground. No, he lies like a politician. Elders didn't always speak, but they always judged. The soundscape of a winter market, unlike summer markets full of shouting, laughter, and wandering musicians, winter markets had their own quiet soundtrack. The crunch of boots on hard snow, the crackle of small fires for warmth, muted conversations wrapped tight like cloaks, the clink of pottery, the rustle of straw, undergoods, the soft bleating of goats who were deeply regretting being brought along. Every sound was strangely soothing, a gentle hum of survival, community, and shared hardship. It was the sort of atmosphere that made you feel both cold and comforted at the same time. The trade items that defined winter. Some goods dominated the cold season. 1. Salted and smoked foods, the backbone of winter meals. If your family had smoked lamb or dried fish, you were blessed. If not, well, cabbage soup it is. 2. Firewood bundles, the medieval equivalent of electricity bills. Nobody joked about firewood prices, ever. 3. Beeswax and tallow candles, the difference between cozy winter evenings and sitting in pitch darkness wondering why wolves sound closer at night. 4. Furs, fox, rabbit, wolf, sheep, anything that kept the cold out was valuable. 5. Grain and flour guarded like treasure, sometimes traded in cups, not sacks. 6. Herbal medicines, especially those for cough, fever, and winter aches. 7. Tools and repairs. A broken axe handle in winter was practically an emergency. These items formed the true heartbeat of winter survival. The market as a social lifeline beyond trading. Winter markets were a rare chance for villagers to see one another. Winter isolated people. Doors stayed shut, paths froze, nights felt endless. So once a week, everyone emerged even briefly to smile, nod, exchange a few words, and reassure themselves, we are all still here. We are all still surviving. It was more than a market. It was proof of life. A moment of warmth. By midday, the cold became unforgiving. A small fire burned in the center of the square, and people gathered around it. Palms stretched out greedily. Someone always brewed a pot of something: herbal tea, weak ale, warm broth. Old stories were told, rumors were exchanged, plans for spring were whispered hopefully, and for a moment, standing around that fire, wrapped in wool and steam, the villagers felt connected not by goods, but by shared endurance. Closing the market, as the pale winter sun began dipping toward the horizon far earlier than anyone liked, the market slowly unwound. Merchants packed their unsold goods. Children chased each other between stalls. Elders gathered their canes and blankets. Goats were finally released from their public misery, and one by one, villagers returned to their homes, disappearing into the snow like fading footprints. Another winter market done. Another week survived. If you've ever sat awake on a winter night and felt the world pause just for a breath, you've tasted a bit of what medieval people lived through every year. But winter wasn't only hardship, it also carried rituals so ancient that even the elders couldn't quite explain them. Festivals that blended fear and joy, and nights so quiet they felt almost sacred. Tonight, let's step gently into that quiet world. A medieval winter night was not just dark, it was profoundly, impossibly quiet. People believed winter silence was alive, that spirits walked in it, that ancestors listened through it, that the world was tuning itself like a great instrument. If you stepped outside alone at night, you could hear your own heartbeat. Most didn't step outside, unless they had to. The nightly rituals inside every home, even in the smallest huts, winter evenings followed a rhythm you could set a clock by, if clocks existed. 1. The fire ritual. The first task every evening, check the embers. If the fire went out, the family faced a freezing night. So, people banked the fire, carefully covering embers with ash, whispering little sayings like, "Stay alive, little fire, we follow your light." And yes, some families genuinely talked to their fire. When you depend on something that much, politeness is a survival tactic. 2. The household circle. Families gathered around the hearth, seated close enough to share warmth, far enough not to become part of the firewood. This was storytelling time, not grand epics. Those were for summer. Winter stories were softer, slower, almost lullabies. Tales of helpful spirits, stories of mischief maker, fairies, patterns hidden in stars. Tomorrow we try again. 4. Quiet work. Women spun wool by firelight, men carved wood or repaired tools. Children learned small crafts. Elders sipped warm drinks and muttered advice nobody asked for. The fire crackled. The wind sighed outside. Life moved like honey, slow, thick, comforting. The winter festivals, ancient, strange, and heartfelt, despite the cold and danger. Medieval people never let winter pass without celebration. It was a way to claim joy, even when the world froze around them. Let's wander through the biggest festivals. The Feast of Midwinter, the long night. The longest night of the year was treated like a living creature, something to be endured, respected, and fed. Families prepared a slightly better meal, a loaf of sweeter bread, dried fruits saved for this night, broth enriched with herbs, maybe a sliver of cheese. May our light last until spring. Songs of winter, soft, simple, and almost sad. Medieval winter songs were not upbeat. They were slow, warm, sometimes melancholy, perfect for sleepless listeners. Actually, they sounded like humming, chanting, gentle melodies, repeating half-remembered verses. Lullabies adults pretended were for children. Women often sang while spinning. Men hummed while sharpening tools. We will make it to morning, and overhead, the real stars burn sharper than in any other season. Cold air makes the sky clearer. Villagers believed the stars came closer in winter, as if checking in. Winter's fear, the things that walk in the dark. No winter is complete without superstitions. People feared the White Wanderer, a spirit said to follow travelers who walked alone at night. The cold mother who tapped windows of newborns. The whistler, a ghost that copied human voices. The silent man who appeared only in snowstorms. Were any of these real? Probably not. Did that stop villagers from closing shutters tightly and saying prayers before bed? Absolutely not. Winter fear is universal. Even today, houses feel different at night when the world is frozen. The sacred quiet, winter's final lesson.